Hey everyone, we're back.
All right, live
like-
stream.
That's how we always start things. We are doing our season 4 live stream now, and we always do these at the end of every season to kind of recap a little bit about the last season that we talked to, and also to allow people the opportunity to ask any questions. You can send questions in advance, usually through sending us an email at podcast@autismwish.org, or you can always send us a message via Messenger on Facebook. Either way, that works. And last season's theme was mostly about like advocacy work to be done.
Right. I think the last half of the season was primarily focused on kind of advocacy, either creating a network within your community or kind of an outreach program. So it's kind of getting your hands dirty, more or less.
Yeah, putting in some elbow grease.
There you go.
We touched on a whole lot of topics in that season. And I actually think for me personally, it was one of my favorite seasons because advocacy has really been really important to me. And I think that it's part of that parenting journey where you obviously don't start off in the advocacy realm. When you first find out that your kid's diagnosed with autism, like very rarely are you in a mental state where you're like, let me jump to advocacy. Like usually it takes a couple steps of processing through all that. So that's why I felt like it was a good thing to start for season 4, because work to be done is kind of like you need to be in a good headspace to be able to do work, to be able to be productive. And so I just felt like that was like a natural progression of what happens next in that process.
Well, both logically and emotionally. I mean, first season, you're kind of hit with, oh, is my child autistic? So you kind of have, from a logical standpoint, like, okay, what do I do now? And then from an emotional standpoint, you're really not sure, okay, what does the future hold for my child, the family? How are we going to kind of merge together? So I think we have to put the building blocks in before we can even get to advocacy. So to start off with advocacy, before you even actually start to put in any work and get your hands dirty, is almost kind of a backwards approach.
Right. So we started off the season really heavily on advocacy. We talked about also prepping for school and how we can teach our kids. Not all kids are capable of self-advocacy, but for the kiddos who can, the importance of teaching them self-advocacy within the school system, like within the real world, and just supplying them or providing them with the skills that they need to survive, essentially, knowing that the world is full of bullies and people who don't understand autism. So we kind of touched a little bit about that. The other thing that we talked about that I kind of still find ironic that we talked about this because I'm terrible at it, but it's like making friendships and keeping friendships both for yourself as a parent and also how to help your autistic child make and keep friends too. I think out of all the things we talked about this season, that one to me is the most challenging, and it's still one that I have challenges with. Like that's still something that's difficult for me. But I think that there's certain things that we can do to at least try to get that ball rolling.
Well, because when you think about, okay, your son or daughter is diagnosed with autism, it's, yes, you are geared towards finding them the therapies and everything they need, resources, everything. But then at the same time, you have to be in a good headspace to be able to continue the process from day to day, month to month, year to year. And for any reason, if your headspace is going to like a negative place, then you're not going to be able to continue this all the way. So you have to make sure that self-care is a priority. Not saying necessarily it's a top priority, but it's still important overall.
And that was one of the things that we talked about in our self-awareness episode about how we do talk about self-care, but that sometimes we miss that first step of like self-awareness, that we're not always aware or in tune with what's going on with us emotionally, psychologically, or even like our children throughout this process. So that self-care thing was kind of what stemmed that episode, because we had done an episode about self-care and I talked about how I'm so terrible at it.
But that's not an excuse. Just because you're terrible at it, you have to keep at it.
Well, I do. I'm here, right? So,
I guess.
um, but it's interesting because I feel like a lot of times people do talk about self-care and they leave out that self-awareness part. And I think that it's important because how can you address self-care if you're not aware of the fact that you need these things? So that was an interesting topic for
Sure,
me.
and we mentioned the idea of like an accountability partner, whether that's a spouse, a boyfriend, family member, anyone who's able to kind of check in and say like, "Hey, are you okay? Like you're seem kind of stressed out. Maybe you could use like a break, a nap, anything." So we did stress the importance of that. That sometimes you, since you're so close to everything, with the therapies and resources and everything, you're too close to basically see that you are kind of cracking a little bit. So you need to kind of hit the reset button and kind of get a refresher of sorts.
Yeah, or like there's symptoms and signs of it, but you don't know what the root cause is. Like you might be lashing out more frequently, or maybe you're just not able to connect with their peers, your spouse, whoever. Something is off and you don't know quite what it is. I feel like those are the moments where we need to do like a self check in and be like, okay, something's up, what's going on, and try to figure out how we're feeling. And then we can dive into self care, which is more of like the solution to the problem. But first, you have to identify the problem.
Right. You have to make sure the problem is you're aware of it.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so that was for me a really kind of like revealing type of episode because it's something that I hadn't thought about too much until pretty much this season. Um, so we talked a bit about that. And that also led into talking about the father's role in autism and why there's such this like disbalance between the role of the mother when it comes to raising autistic kids and the role of the father. Why are mothers or female advocates way more likely to be vocal about this sort of thing than fathers that tend to be quieter when it comes to this sort of thing? And that episode was really all about you.
I know. I hate being the center of attention where everything is geared towards me. That's why I push as much off on you as I can.
I know I do all the talking, but it's
But that's
okay.
okay.
I'm a
It's okay.
talker.
Yeah, you love to talk.
So that was like fun, I think, because I do like that we are able to kind of give a voice to that community, the community of fathers who maybe think and feel the same way as you, but they're not online. Like they're just not in the autism universe because women tend to be more likely to be social on social media and commenting and doing all the research. So sometimes we forget that the fathers exist. And it was important to me to be able to incorporate the father's
Well,
opinions.
I mean, it's still very telling because, excuse me, because you can see in the fathers communities that it's almost like a fracture point or something lying beneath the surface. So they are kind of caught off guard as far as like, oh, I didn't realize like my wife or girlfriend was basically at her end and she's basically kind of like broken. And so that's where we kind of tied in as far as making sure that you have good communication with whoever your support system is, because you don't want to go up until a point where you're at your breaking point and having said nothing or given enough notice to your backup that you need help until it's too late and there's not much you can really do at that point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of communication.
Right.
But again, there's that part of self-awareness. Like if you're not self-aware, how can you communicate if you don't know what the problem is? Like you're not aware you have a problem with something. And one of the things we talked about was how for men it tends to be more often than for women that the reason there's a communication breakdown after an autism diagnosis is because the father is still processing this and maybe processing it differently than the mom or female figure in that child's life would be. So sometimes there's a disconnect there because the mom wants to grieve a certain way or process a certain way, and then the father wants to do it kind of like the polar opposite. So maybe she needs to talk about it. She needs to bring it up. She needs to do research. She needs to go talk to all the doctors. And to the dad, it's like, no, I don't want to do anything about that. Like, I'm not ready. I don't want to hear it. I need to go and process this internally.
Right.
So I feel like that's where a little bit of that clash comes.
Right. So it's just making sure that both of you are aware of what the other one's doing. So you at least know what the situation is rather than making assumptions about the other person and it kind of going to a negative place very quickly. So just keeping the other person in mind and knowing that how you're dealing with something may not be how they're dealing with something, but you can have a conversation about that. And you honestly might learn more about your spouse, girlfriend, family member than you did before.
Exactly. And we also did an episode on potty training. Um, that why are you laughing?
Well, I was going to say because I think of potty training with what do we call it, like, or I'm
Like little littles.
well, I'm thinking of like the three P's. You need patience, paper towels, and prizes when they do it right.
I was thinking of a fourth P that you definitely need.
The PPP.
You definitely need that one. That's half the problem.
There we go.
So I had somebody left a voice message. Her name is Jasmine Greer, and her question was in regards to potty training. This is a voice message. I won't be able to play it now, but if you ever want to leave voice messages, you can just use speakpipe.com/embracing autism, and we might feature your voicemail in one of our future podcast episodes. But this question was surrounding potty training. So it was actually pretty good that we did do one of these episodes this season because we heard that a lot of people were struggling with potty training. And so the question was essentially like, how do I progress with potty training? Like, what do I do if my child's autistic and it seems like I'm doing everything that you typically are supposed to do, and my child, I just can't potty train them. And so we do have an entire episode dedicated to that. So I'll keep this brief, but I think that was episode 405 or so. Um, and essentially, I think the key for us at least was just consistency because we tried here and there and we were doing all the techniques correctly. Like we were doing all the things we were supposed to be doing, but we weren't being consistent with it. We are working full time, both of us. So that limited us to only be able to potty train when we were home, like after 4 or 5 p.m. And then they would go to bed at like 7. So we would only get in like 2 hours of potty training a day. And that really was not working. So what we ultimately ended up doing is we knew that we would have to have a good chunk of time to just dedicate to potty training. And so what we did is we saved up some vacation time around Christmas. And I took 2 solid weeks off of work. And during those 2 weeks, we basically sat down and were like, okay, we're going to dedicate these entire 2 weeks to nothing but potty training. Like, we're going to focus on being like militant with this. So every 15 minutes, bringing them to the bathroom. Like, they don't have to wear a diaper or anything at first if that's too hard with like fine motor skills. And then we would just consistently bring them there, load them up with a ton of fluids. If you still have a child in diapers, changing those diapers in the bathroom so that they associate potty time with the bathroom. We tried a whole bunch of different things, kind of like all at once. And ultimately it worked. And I think it was the consistency.
Right. I was going to say it's kind of an uncomfortable or like painful process because once you basically say, okay, they're not going to be wearing diapers, they are using the potty, and that's it. You are basically following them around, and in many cases, Leah was rushing them to the potty while I'm getting the paper towels and cleaning up one
It's a
mess.
two-person job.
And I was going to say, sometimes it was I clean up one spot here, and then there's another spot right across the family
Yeah.
room. So, I mean, it's a struggle, and you just have to be consistent with it. It's so easy to be kind of in your mind where you're like, oh, I'll just put a diaper on them and just kind of help me out. But you're really doing yourself a great disservice there. You just have to push through and kind of just clean up the messes as they come and consistently take them to the potty after, or if you catch them as they're starting to rush them there. And then slowly over time, they kind of get the hang of it. So it's a challenge.
And I found that, like, for us, the oldest one was more of a struggle to potty train than the younger one. She had a harder time because, honestly, when it comes to their autism diagnosis, I would say hers is a little more significant. She's more significantly impacted than the youngest. And so she has more of that motor processing issue. And so for her, we had started potty training her like a solid year before the other one because the other one was still only one. And we actually realized that she could not pick it up at all. So what we did is when the younger one was ready, she was around 2 or so, we started potty training her and just letting the older one kind of observe. So having kind of like a potty partner, if you do have siblings or classmates or a friend who wouldn't mind, that helped out because when we did that, it kind of motivated the older one because she wanted to do whatever her sister was doing. So once her sister was showing interest and actually enjoying like the process of learning, she started like clinging on and being like, I want to do this too. So that made it a lot easier. And I don't know if we would have been able to do it as easily if we had not had that second child.
That's true. They did kind of help each other in that sense. So I think it would have been a struggle without the other one to kind of lead the path a little bit. So
Mhm.
it's a challenge either way. So just hang in there and keep at it, I guess.
And I would say also if your child is older, like say they're like 5 or 6 and you still can't get them potty trained, make sure that you do get them checked out by a pediatrician just to rule out any sort of medical issue. It might not be, but there are some cases where there are some medical problems, and because the child is autistic, they perhaps don't have a great sensation of their body, so they can't really tell you something's wrong, or if they're nonverbal, they obviously can't tell you something's wrong. So if you try really long time, it might be a good thing to go and check in with a pediatrician just to rule anything out. They might refer you to a urologist or something like that. But that's pretty much what we did. We just did consistency, took 2 weeks off, and just did it all at once, and then just went crazy. And they picked it up. Um, and then the other thing that we talked about was so we have moved to a new location now. And as you can probably tell from Matt's background, we have not been able to fully set up our studio yet. Yes, he's in a closet. um, so I'll make jokes about you coming out later.
It's so cozy in here.
So one of the things that we were working on when we moved here was trying to create our new neighborhood tribe. So we moved from a completely different state. And so when we came here, we know, like, we still don't really know anyone. It's only been a little while. But we had to kind of recreate all those roots and foundations that we had before. When we were back at our last place, we had spent those last 3 years creating connections and finding resources and everything for our kids. So it's really important when you go to a new location to just try to create those connections again, create that network, find that tribe. Because as you know, it's hard to find help when it comes to raising an autistic kid. And if there's ever, like, God forbid, an emergency, you need to be able to find somebody that you can kind of like rely on, whether that's like a neighbor or a church friend or whatever it may be. So that's like something that we talked about this season that we are actively having to rebuild ourselves right now.
Well, I think you have to be proactive, especially if you move to a new area where you don't know anyone. Um, yeah, you can sit at home and hopefully someone will knock on your door because they know that you're new and they want to introduce themselves. But otherwise, you're kind of the new one. So it's almost your opportunity, or it kind of falls to you to kind of introduce yourself to the community or find a church or social group out there because they might not even necessarily know that you're a new person in the community.
And I want to say thank you to Carol Kistner and Sajad Ahmad. I see that you guys liked and loved. Thank you. Um, yeah, so the neighborhood thing, that's something that we are still actively working on. And it's interesting, like, go talk to your neighbors because we found out that, like, our next door neighbor is connected to autism. I haven't dug deep because I know it's a sensitive topic, but they're wearing like a puzzle piece shirt, and I caught that they had like an autism awareness bracelet, and like it's a small world. Who would have thought that our next door neighbor would have had some sort of like um, some sort of autism connection, essentially? So reach out. I feel like that's something that was kind of like considered an old timey thing that people don't do as much anymore. Like if
Right.
somebody rings your doorbell or knocks on your door, we tend to like hide and like what are they leaving? So I feel like that's something that's kind of been lost. And I think because of that, we have a harder time finding our community support. So I would just advise like trying to create those connections again. And that was something that we talked about a lot in that episode.
Which is a challenge because neither of us are super
Social?
extroverts.
Yeah.
Oh, social, that too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're not extroverts at all. Despite what you may think from this podcast, I think we're only okay with this podcast because there's no person in front
That's
of us.
true.
It's just us. So if y'all were actually here in the room with us, we'd probably be like really quiet. So yeah, that was like really interesting. And then there was two kind of tougher topics that we touched on this season. One of those was about disinformation when it comes to autism. Actually, three big topics: revisiting the ABA debate and also the new profound autism debate. Which of those three do you think was like the toughest?
So I didn't really know much about the what was it, newfound
Profound autism?
right. So I didn't really know much about that one. I thought kind of the nice one that I actually enjoyed was revisiting the ABA because I feel like we were so new to kind of the autism world. We had just kind of heard in passing or what we had read online or the history behind ABA, and it wasn't really a overly, I don't know, fair approach to kind of diving into it when you don't really know much about it. So I think by revisiting it, we're kind of opening our mind up a little bit to other perspectives and other ways to try and do therapy. We personally don't do it just because of the time commitment, but I can see why other people would. And obviously, we kind of pointed out, make sure that you always have a good therapist that your child connects with. And I mean, kind of from there.
I think the other thing that kind of swayed me a little bit more, I would still consider myself a fence sitter when it comes to ABA, but only because to me has to be case specific. Like I can't just say, yeah, all ABA is good or all ABA is bad. I have to know specifically what clinic we're talking about. And so I don't make like a blanket statement. But the thing that was really eye-opening to me was that Embracing Autism IRL interview that we did with Kate Slade. The ABA, she was an autistic adult who ran an ABA clinic. She was the director of an ABA clinic. If you guys haven't seen that yet, that's on our YouTube channel. If you just search the key phrase Embracing Autism IRL, it'll come up. But that interview to me was like really eye-opening because I got to see the perspective of an autistic adult who supports ADA and does ADA and how she has put in all these like key, I guess, guidelines and boundaries to make sure that nothing is kind of going wrong. She took out and eliminated those parts of like ADA that people often have conflict with. And so to me, I'm like, well, if we get enough people who are doing ABA to do it that way, and we're clearly including the autistic voice because it's an autistic adult who is running this facility, I feel like it could be done correctly. And then the other point that she made that was really eye-opening in the interview is she was saying that, yes, horrible things happened in ABA back then, but horrible things happen across the board in any medical or psychiatric facility at the time. So she was right. Like, it's true. All of psychology essentially back then was also horrific. Like, people were thrown into insane asylums for ridiculous reasons. Like, people were having surgery without anesthesia. Like, the beginnings of all processes or medical methodologies tend to start off that way, at least back in the day. Not so much now that we have these ethics boards, but prior to ethics boards, it was like that everywhere. So I feel like that was kind of like the point that struck me really. And I was like, you know what, you're right. Like, that makes sense. I can't really be upset that ABA used to be this big abusive thing now because everything else was. And we still go to our doctors, right? We still go to our dentist. We don't say, well, the dentist used to be horrible, so I'm not going to be a dentist or go to the dentist anymore. So I think that that's kind of like what really struck me from that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, now that you mentioned, as far as thinking about the origins of kind of the medical field and how some of the practices clearly are no longer done because they've kind of been outdated with modern techniques. But it's interesting that that one still has the stigma and hasn't really ever pulled out of that.
Yeah. I think that that's kind of the case with a couple different things, and I don't really understand why. But it's easy to fall into that trap because, like, I fell into it, you fell into it initially because that's all you hear. So I've definitely learned to make sure that I'm hearing both sides of every argument to make sure that I'm making like a well-rounded decision. And if I'm not so sure, then I just fence it because it can go either way, essentially.
That's fair.
And then we talked about profound autism and dispelling misinformation. Profound autism is just like the current debate that's happening now. So on top of the ABA debate, there's now the debate with profound autism. That one, I'm just interested to see what's going to happen in the future. I don't really have any new information on that, but I'm curious to see how that ends up going.
Yeah, I mean, that'll impact a lot of people regardless of what the decision is. So, yeah, hopefully we'll find out at some point.
So we only have a couple minutes here, so I'm gonna wrap this up. But first, a couple things. If you followed our Facebook page, you will see that I'm so excited. We have hit over 25,000 listeners now. I am so excited about that. So if you haven't followed us yet, our Facebook and Instagram is at Autism Wish. And I highly recommend you follow it if you don't already, because we post a lot of event details there for things like this, live streaming, gifting events for Autism Wish, things like that. But yeah, 25,000, and we did this right on time for our 1 year anniversary of the podcast.
We're like, what?
That's great.
3 days until.
Yeah, we were like looking at our downloads and we're like, oh, I don't think we're gonna make it. I don't think we're gonna make it. And then I just kind of gave up. I was like, there's no way we're gonna hit 25,000 by our first year. And then lo and behold, I log in and we're like at 25,100 plus. I was like, oh my gosh, we did it. We did it.
I think we found out we're in what, 54 countries?
Oh yeah, we also broke that threshold. We're in 50 plus countries now. And didn't we hit every continent except Antarctica?
That's true. So if there's any scientists, we just need them to listen, and we got Antarctica.
If you know anybody who's in Antarctica right now, tell them about embracing autism. And if they don't have any connection to autism, tell them one download is all we need.
Just check it off the list.
So that was really, really exciting, and we're so happy about that. We're just gonna keep, chugging along. We've got a lot of plans for the future, the next season. I think we already announced next season's theme, which is wounds. What is it? Wounds healed. And that is basically a theme of, I don't want to say necessarily just like a hurt associated with autism, because I don't really mean that in a strictly emotional sense. But I mean like all those unique challenges, like the lack of support, both for your child or from your family or community. Things like burnout, caregiver burnout, that's really important, not really talked about a lot. Things like if your child is grieving, like let's say your child finds out their own diagnosis and they are grieving their own diagnosis, which many people do. I know like some people really like when they have a diagnosis because it clarifies so much for them. But some people are the opposite. Some people, when they get a diagnosis, they're like, oh, it's validating there's something wrong with me. So it just depends on the person and how they'll react. So we'll be talking more about those sorts of things in this season, with a focus on healing, because I think that it's important not to just list problems. I've listened to podcasts, and one of the inspirations for this one is I was listening to podcasts about autism, and it seemed like a lot of the podcasts were just focused on kind of like the negativity and just the wounds, but there was no healing, there was no optimism, there was no like light at the end of the tunnel. So this theme, although it's focused on wounds to heal, the emphasis is more on that healing, like being able to see that light at the end of the tunnel, and being able to make like light of the situation when appropriate, essentially. So I'm excited about that one, and I hope that's a theme that will resonate with some of you guys.
Yeah. You said pretty much everything there, and then some. So for me to throw in.
If you guys have any questions, you can feel free to submit them real quick, or you can always send us an email at podcast@autismwish.org. We check that email regularly, and in there we will be able to respond to you directly to any questions that you may have, or we may just use those questions in a future episode if we felt like we already were going to have an episode that addresses that. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask you guys to please subscribe to our YouTube channel because we need 100 subscriptions to be able to change the name of it. So right now, you can only find the channel if you search the key term Embracing Autism IRL. So you have to type in that key phrase to find us and then subscribe. We need 100 subscribers in order to change the name so it's not like a bunch of numbers and letters.
I like how the goal is to be able to change the name, like real,
I just want to change the name.
real low bar, but
So like subscribe and share and see if you can get us to that 100 so we can change that name for you guys. And then again, if you could just please take a moment, if you enjoy our podcast, if you get value from it, if you get value from these live streams, it would help us a ton if you just left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. These 5-star reviews are important because our sponsors take a look at a couple of things when they consider donating for our kiddos for our Autism Wish gift drive. And some of the things that they look at is how many followers we have on social media, how many likes we have. They'll look at like our impact, so how many gift giving things we do, how many people we're able to gift. But they also look at our reach, and our podcast is a big part of that. So having that 25,000 audience is really helpful, but those reviews are really the best because they can see that there's value to our content from that. So if you could leave us those reviews, that helps us attract the sponsors, that helps us fund these gifting events. It's really easy to do. Just search for Embracing Autism on Apple Podcasts. It should show up, scroll down to the bottom of the page. There should be a button that says like write a review or leave a review. Click on that, and that's it.
and then just say, "Oh my gosh, Matt, you're amazing. If only you could not talk as much."
No, just me. I was kidding. Everyone's probably like, I love this. Please tell Leah to talk less. But yes, I'm really looking forward to the next season. I hope you guys enjoyed this season. That's all we have for now. And we will catch you next time. Again, a reminder, tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, we will have the live stream going of our Embracing Autism IRL interview series. That will also be playing here on Facebook, YouTube, and will be available for playback as well. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.